I'm Casey Everett, 25 male. I'm an IT engineer living in Salem, Oregon, a city where the streets are lined with old oak trees. My life was steady and predictable until a quiet betrayal in my own family forced me to uncover a truth more painful than I could have imagined. This is the story of how my parents tried to steal my grandfather's mind, and how he taught me that the greatest honor isn't found in revenge but in forgiveness. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. If you were to ask me about my childhood, I'd tell you it was split between two entirely different worlds. One was a small wooden cabin nestled by the shore of Lake Fairview, a place that smelled of pine needles and my grandmother's butter cookies. The other was a cold, imposing mansion in West Salem Heights, a house that felt more like a museum than a home, filled with my parents' ambitions and their suffocating need for control. The cabin was my sanctuary, the mansion was my obligation. My grandfather, George Everett, was the heart of that cabin. At 78, he still possessed the unwavering posture of the Air Force lieutenant colonel he once was. He was a man of few words, but every one of them carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. He'd been awarded a Medal of Honor for his service, but he kept it tucked away in a drawer, believing that a man's honor was measured by his daily actions, not by the decorations on his wall. His hair was silver, his back was straight, and his eyes were the color of the lake on a calm morning, deep, gentle, and knowing. He taught me that discipline was just another word for self-respect. If you can't keep a promise to yourself, Casey, he'd say, how can you ever expect to keep one for anyone else? He taught me through small, quiet actions. He showed me how to polish my shoes until I could see my reflection in them and how to fold a blanket with corners so sharp they could cut glass. The details make the man, he'd tell me, and I believed him. I once ruined a pair of his expensive leather shoes by using the wrong polish. I was terrified, expecting a lecture that would shake the walls. Instead, he just looked at them, then at me, and a small smile touched his lips. Mistakes are just lessons, Casey, he said gently, so long as you don't make them twice. He then sat down beside me and patiently showed me how to fix my error. That was my grandfather, firm but kind, a teacher in everything he did. The warmth in that cabin came from my grandmother, Ruth. She was the perfect complement to my grandfather's quiet strength. Her hair was a cloud of dyed chestnut curls, she always wore soft lavender perfume, and her laughter could fill every corner of the house. She taught me to listen with my heart. People talk with more than just their mouths, Casey, she'd whisper while we baked cookies. They talk with their eyes, with their silence. You have to learn to hear what isn't being said. She was the soul of our family, the gentle hand that balanced my grandfather's military discipline with boundless affection. The summers I spent with them were the brightest moments of my life. I'd wake up early and find Grandpa on the porch, sipping black coffee and watching the mist rise off Lake Fairview. He'd share stories from his time in the service, not to brag, but to teach me about courage and integrity. My parents, Stephen and Marjorie Everett, lived in a world far removed from the simple peace of the cabin. My father was a financial advisor, a man who wore expensive suits but always seemed to carry a sense of unease, as if he were constantly walking on eggshells around my mother. My mother was a behavioral psychologist, brilliant and fiercely ambitious, with a deeply ingrained belief that control was the highest form of love. Their mansion was a monument to that belief. Every wall was pristine white, every piece of furniture was perfectly placed, and the garden was trimmed with surgical precision. It was luxurious, but it was sterile. There was no warmth, no shared stories on a porch, no scent of freshly baked cookies, only the cold echo of ambition. Visits from my parents to the cabin were always strained. My father seemed to shrink in my grandfather's presence, avoiding his gaze as if he were hiding a secret. My mother, on the other hand, would put on a performance of perfect daughter-in-law, her smile bright but brittle. You need to learn to control your emotions, Casey, she would often tell me. Weakness is not a quality successful people display. But I never wanted to be strong in the way she meant. I wanted to be like my grandfather, strong because he was honest, not because he hid his feelings. I remember once when I was about 10, I overheard my father and grandfather talking in the living room. My grandfather's voice was low and serious, while my father spoke of opportunities and the future. I didn't understand the specifics, but the tension was thick enough to taste. My father left looking defeated, and Grandpa sat alone on the porch for hours, staring out at the water. I crept out and sat beside him, not daring to speak. He simply ruffled my hair and said, "Never let greed cloud your judgment, Casey." The words felt heavy, like a prophecy I wouldn't understand for years to come. As I got older, the visits to the cabin grew less frequent. My life became a blur of school friends and planning for my own future as an IT engineer. My parents were consumed by their careers. Then when I was 23, the phone call came. It was my father, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. "It's your grandmother, Casey, she's gone. She had passed away in her sleep from a stroke." There was no warning, no long goodbye. Just a sudden, deafening silence that ripped through the heart of our family. I remember driving to the lake that morning, my chest feeling like it was filled with lead. The cabin looked the same, but the soul inside it was gone. My grandfather was on the porch in his usual rocking chair holding a cold cup of coffee. He didn't cry, but the light in his eyes had gone out. He was just a man staring at an empty lake, lost in a world that no longer had his other half in it. The silence between us was profound, a shared grief too deep for words. He was wearing the checkered shirt she had always loved, and in that moment he seemed smaller, like a great oak tree that had just lost its strongest branch. The beautiful days of my childhood were officially over. For the next 2 years, my grandfather lived alone in that cabin by the lake. I made it a point to visit as often as I could, sometimes staying for the entire weekend, sleeping in the small room that had been mine since I was a boy. The faint scent of pine and my grandmother's cookies still lingered in the air, but it was a ghost of a memory. The oven in the kitchen remained cold. I tried to fill the silence, helping him with chores, mowing the lawn, and dusting the old photographs that lined the mantelpiece. But his loneliness was a fortress, an invisible wall that I couldn't seem to break through. He was fading. He still held on to his discipline. His shoes were always polished, and his bed was made with the same sharp corners he'd taught me to fold. But the man himself was retreating from the world. The townspeople who once looked upon George Everett with respect now saw him as a quiet old man who spent his days staring at the water, searching for something that was no longer there. I'd find him in the living room, his gaze fixed on the empty armchair where my grandmother used to sit and knit. "Are you doing okay, Grandpa?" I'd ask, already knowing the answer. He would offer a sad, distant smile. "I'm still here, Casey," he'd reply, his voice raspy with disuse. "But living isn't the same as being alive." My worry for him grew with each visit. Every time I drove away from the cabin, a heavy sense of dread settled in my stomach. Meanwhile, my parents seemed to drift even further away. They were always too busy with work to visit. My father was chasing big contracts, and my mother was engrossed in her work at the behavioral health center, dissecting the minds of strangers while remaining oblivious to the suffering within her own family. I confronted her once. "Mom, why don't you and Dad visit him? He needs us." She looked at me with her characteristically sharp, analytical eyes. "Your grandfather is a strong man, Casey. He's resilient. Besides, my schedule is completely packed." It was an excuse, and we both knew it. There was an unspoken chasm between my parents and my grandfather, a rift that had been there for years, and now it was wider than ever. Then one evening, my parents did something completely unexpected. They showed up at the cabin with a bottle of expensive wine and smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They proposed that Grandpa come live with them in West Salem Heights. "Dad," my father began, his voice laced with an insincere gentleness, "we think it's time you moved in with us. Our house is comfortable and we can take better care of you." My mother nodded in perfect synchrony, her voice dripping with sweetness. "That's right, Dad. You shouldn't be all alone out here. We worry about you constantly." For a moment, a spark of hope ignited within me. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the chance for our fractured family to finally start healing. But my grandfather was not easily swayed. He shook his head, his voice low but firm. "I don't want to be a burden," he said, his eyes fixed on the empty chair beside him. "This house is where Ruth is. I can still feel her here." His words were a punch to the gut. He wasn't just clinging to a house. He was holding onto the last vestiges of his life with her. My parents, however, were persistent. They began visiting more frequently, each time armed with new arguments about his health, his safety, and the convenience of their modern mansion. They painted a picture of a comfortable, worry-free life. After months of their relentless campaign, he finally gave in. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a tired resignation. "For you, Casey," he said softly, "I don't want you to spend your life worrying about this old man." The day he moved was one of the hardest of my life. I helped him pack his few belongings, some clothes, the Medal of Honor, and a small wooden box filled with the letters my grandmother had written to him during the war. Each item felt like a relic from a life that was being dismantled. As we stood on the porch for the last time, he placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Promise me this isn't goodbye to this place, Casey. Promise me we'll come back." Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded. "I promise, Grandpa." We watched the sun set over Lake Fairview, the water shimmering like a pool of liquid gold, trying to burn the image into our memories. I truly believed things would get better. I thought that in the luxurious comfort of my parents' home, he would find peace and companionship. I felt a sense of relief, convincing myself that he would finally be cared for in the way he deserved. I was so naive. The mansion in West Salem Heights, with all its sterile grandeur, didn't heal our family. It only exposed the cracks that had been festering for years, and soon it would become the stage for a betrayal I never could have seen coming. At first, everything appeared perfect on the surface. My mother, Marjorie, transformed into the model of a devoted caregiver. She prepared my grandfather's meals with meticulous attention to his dietary needs, laid out his blood pressure medication every morning, and even purchased a plush new armchair for him. "This is much more comfortable than that old wooden thing at the cabin, isn't it, Dad?" she'd say with a dazzling smile. My grandfather would just give a slight nod, his gaze drifting towards the large window, as if he could see Lake Fairview through the manicured lawns of West Salem Heights. My father played his part too, making a show of checking on Grandpa's health and engaging him in conversations about the stock market, a topic my grandfather had absolutely no interest in. Whenever I visited on weekends, I was greeted with this scene of domestic harmony. I'd bring homemade butter cookies using my grandmother's recipe, and we'd sit in the cavernous living room, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was bright, but it lacked the cozy warmth of the cabin. My grandfather clung to his routines: black coffee in the morning, the newspaper, and his old stories. He was still sharp, his memory a steel trap. He could recall the exact date he met my grandmother at an army dance and would laugh as he recounted the time I'd ruined his shoes as a boy. "You were always the clumsiest kid I knew, Casey," he'd chuckle, and for a moment it felt like we were back on the porch by the lake. But after only a few weeks, subtle changes began to creep in. It started with small things. He'd misplace his reading glasses or forget the name of a neighbor he used to talk about all the time. One afternoon, he called me Stephen, my father's name, before quickly correcting himself with an embarrassed apology. "Getting old, Casey," he mumbled, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He seemed perpetually tired, often dozing off mid-conversation in his new armchair, the newspaper sliding from his lap to the floor. I was concerned, but my mother, with all the authority of her psychology degree, was quick to reassure me. "It's a perfectly normal part of the aging process, Casey," she explained, her tone clinical and detached. "He's still grieving and adjusting to a new environment. His mind just needs time to catch up." I wanted to believe her. I desperately needed to. This was the man who, just a month prior, had engaged me in a complex debate about the future of artificial intelligence, remembering every technical detail I mentioned. How could a mind so sharp dull so quickly? That's when I started noticing the little oddities. My mother always prepared my grandfather's coffee herself in the kitchen, away from everyone else. She would bring him a separate, specific cup. My father, while not directly involved, often loitered nearby, exchanging hushed words with her that I could never quite hear. One day, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and saw her pouring something from a small, unlabeled vial into his coffee. She jumped when she saw me, quickly pocketing the vial and forcing a smile. "Just a little sweetener, Casey. Your grandfather has been saying his coffee tastes too bitter lately." The lie was so blatant it sent a shiver down my spine. My grandfather never took sugar. He liked his coffee black and bitter, like life, as he used. "I'll tell a joke." I didn't challenge her, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. What truly terrified me was his behavior after drinking that coffee. Within minutes, he would become incredibly drowsy. His eyelids would droop, his speech would become slurred, and he would struggle to keep his head up. I watched him one morning, just minutes after finishing his cup, as he slumped forward in his chair, his breathing becoming heavy and labored. I confronted my mother again. "Is Grandpa okay? He's sleeping all the time." She maintained her perfect, placid smile. "Old people need their rest, Casey. You worry too much." My father, seated at the dining table, nodded in agreement but refused to meet my gaze. A few days later, while my parents were out, I searched the kitchen for that mysterious vial. I checked every cabinet, every drawer, every spice rack. It was gone. The vague unease I'd been feeling began to crystallize into genuine fear. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. He started speaking in disjointed sentences, mixing up memories, sometimes talking about my grandmother as if she were still in the next room. "Where's Ruth?" he asked me one afternoon, his eyes glazed over. "She promised she'd make you some cookies today." My heart clenched. I gently took his hand. "Grandma's gone, Grandpa, but I'm here." He stared at me, a flicker of pained recognition crossing his face before the fog rolled back in. My instincts were screaming at me. This wasn't just old age. This wasn't grief. Something was being done to him in this house. I fought against the thought, trying to convince myself that my own parents, the people who raised me, were incapable of such a thing. But the warning bells in my head were deafening. One morning, I decided to act on my suspicion. I arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, the morning sun casting long shadows across the polished floors. My grandfather was at the dining table with his usual cup of black coffee, the newspaper open but unread. "Morning, Grandpa," I said cheerfully. He turned and managed a weak smile. "Casey, you're early." He started telling me a story, but his words were halting, his memory faltering. When my mother entered the kitchen, he stood up, saying he needed to find his glasses. His coffee cup, still almost full, sat steaming on the table. This was my chance. An overwhelming impulse took over me. I had to know. I picked up the cup, pretending to admire it, and took a tiny, cautious sip. The familiar bitter taste of coffee hit my tongue, but underneath it, there was a faint, almost imperceptible chemical sweetness. I put the cup down just as my mother returned. Minutes later, a strange fog started to cloud my own mind. My eyelids felt heavy, my thoughts became sluggish and difficult to grasp. My heart started to race. This wasn't just coffee. I excused myself to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to clear my spinning head. The warning bells were no longer ringing, they were screaming. There was something in the coffee, and I had a terrible feeling I knew who was putting it there. That night was sleepless. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the unsettling fog from that single sip of coffee having long since cleared, leaving behind a terrifying clarity. The questions raced through my mind, each one more horrifying than the last. My parents were my first thought, Stephen and Marjorie Everett. Could they be intentionally harming my grandfather? The idea felt monstrous, a betrayal so profound I could barely comprehend it. But the evidence, however circumstantial, was pointing in a direction I couldn't ignore. I needed proof. A suspicion wasn't enough. I needed cold, hard facts. My grandfather had taught me about honor, and I knew I would be dishonoring his memory if I let this go. A few days later, I went back to the mansion, this time with a plan. In my pocket, I carried a small, empty vial I'd purchased from a pharmacy. I waited for the familiar morning ritual to unfold. My mother prepared my grandfather's coffee in the kitchen and brought it to him in the living room. As she set it down, I accidentally knocked over a glass of water on the end table. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, creating a moment of distraction. As she turned to get a paper towel, my hands moved with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I uncapped my vial, quickly poured a small amount of his coffee into it, and slipped it back into my pocket. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt like a criminal in my own family's home, but I knew this was the only way. That same afternoon, I drove to Portland to see Liam, a friend from college who now worked as a lab technician. He looked at the vial with curiosity. "You sure you want me to run tests on this, Casey?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I tried to keep my voice even. "I just need to know what's in it, Liam, no questions asked." He must have seen the desperation in my eyes because he simply nodded and took the sample. 2 days, law. His call came. He asked me to come to the lab, and the gravity in his voice sent a chill through me. When I arrived, his face was grim. He handed me a printed report. "Casey," he began, his voice low, "this coffee sample contains zolpidem. You probably know it as Ambien." He pointed to a section of the report. "It's a sedative. The dosage is low, but with long-term exposure, it would absolutely cause confusion, short-term memory loss, and severe drowsiness. Where on earth did you get this?" I stood there staring at the words on the page. Zolpidem, a sleeping pill. The symptoms Liam described were a perfect match for my grandfather's condition. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. My first instinct was pure rage. I wanted to drive back to that mansion, slam the lab report on the table, and scream at my parents until my throat was raw. But I reined it in. A confrontation without a complete picture would be a mistake. They would deny it, call me crazy, and find a way to cover their tracks. If I was right about this, then I was dealing with people who were methodical and manipulative. I needed more than a lab report. I needed undeniable proof of their actions. "Thank you, Liam," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Please don't mention this to anyone." He nodded, his eyes filled with a worried concern that I couldn't bring myself to address. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the dark for hours, the lab report lying on the table like a verdict. My own parents were systematically drugging my grandfather, their own father. The question that burned in my mind was why. What could possibly motivate them to do something so cruel? It had to be about more than just making him easier to manage. I decided my next step had to be covert. I needed to see what was happening when I wasn't there. That evening, knowing my parents were attending a charity gala downtown, I let myself into the mansion with the spare key I still had. In my bag were 2 tiny spy cameras I'd bought online. They were small enough to be hidden almost anywhere and capable of recording for days on end. My hands trembled as I worked, feeling like an intruder, a spy betraying the very people who raised me. But the image of my grandfather, his eyes clouded and confused, spurred me on. I placed the first camera in the kitchen, wedged in a small crevice in the spice rack, with a clear view of the counter where my mother prepared the coffee. The second one went in the living room, tucked away on a high bookshelf, its lens aimed at my grandfather's new armchair. Leaving the house that night, I felt a knot of guilt and fear in my stomach. I was crossing a line, spying on my own family, but my grandfather's voice echoed in my head, the one that taught me about courage and doing what's right, no matter how hard it is. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was doing this for him. I was becoming the unseen witness to their quiet crime. A few days later, sitting alone in my apartment, I finally worked up the nerve to check the footage. My heart pounded as I logged into the secure feed from the cameras. The kitchen feed lit up my laptop screen, showing the familiar, gleaming surfaces of my parents' home. Soon, my mother entered the frame. She moved with a casual grace, a picture of domestic efficiency. I watched, my breath held, as she took a coffee mug from the cabinet. She then turned her back to the camera for a moment, and when she turned back, I saw it. She pulled the small, unlabeled vial from the pocket of her apron and carefully tapped a small amount of white powder into the mug. She stirred it methodically before adding the coffee, her expression calm and practiced. My blood ran cold. I replayed the clip over and over, desperately hoping my eyes were deceiving me, but the evidence was irrefutable. It wasn't sweetener, it was poison. I switched to the living room camera. A few minutes later, my father appeared, standing beside my mother as she carried the mug to my grandfather, who was attempting to read the newspaper. "Here's your coffee, Dad," she said, her voice a melody of false concern. My father said nothing, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of silent complicity. My grandfather took the cup with a grateful smile and took a sip. I watched in horror as within minutes the sedative took hold. His head began to droop, his focus wavered, and the newspaper slipped from his grasp as he drifted into a drugged stupor. I slammed my laptop shut, a wave of nausea and fury washing over me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just neglect, it was a calculated daily assault. I had to tell my grandfather, but how? How do you tell a man that his own son and daughter-in-law are poisoning him? I needed to be careful to choose my moment. The opportunity came a few days later when my parents went out for dinner with clients. I found my grandfather in his armchair, staring blankly at the perfectly trimmed garden. He looked so frail, so lost. I sat down beside him. "Grandpa," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "I need to show you something important." I saw a flicker of his old sharpness return to his eyes as he looked at me. He knew something was wrong. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. I showed him the video from the kitchen. I watched his face as he saw his daughter-in-law, my mother, sprinkle the powder into his coffee. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white, but he remained silent. His military discipline was holding him together, but I could see the profound hurt in his eyes. When the video ended, I told him everything: the coffee sample, the lab results, the Ambien. "I didn't want to believe it, Grandpa," I whispered, tears finally escaping my eyes. "But I think they're doing this to you on purpose." He didn't respond for a long time. He just sat there, the stoic soldier, absorbing a wound far deeper than any he had faced in battle. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and raspy with pain. "If this is true, Casey, I need to know why. I raised Stephen to be an honorable man. If he's capable of this, I have to understand what drove him to it." In that moment, a new plan formed between us. It was bold and risky. "They think you're confused and weak," I said. "Let's use that. Keep pretending, drink the coffee, act drowsy, but don't swallow it. We can pour it out when they're not looking." A sad, wry smile touched his lips. "You want me to act, Casey? I was a soldier. I know how to follow orders." He agreed, not for revenge, but for the truth. From that day on, my grandfather became the best actor I had ever seen. After my mother served him his morning coffee, he would make a show of sipping it. Then when her back was turned, he would discreetly pour the contents into a large potted plant in the corner of the living room. He'd feign drowsiness, slur his words, and allow himself to look utterly defeated. It was agonizing to watch the man who taught me about self-respect pretend to have none. But every time our eyes met, I saw the resilient soldier beneath the facade, his gaze steady and determined. My work wasn't done. I needed to know the why. I bought 2 more cameras, this time with audio capabilities. Late one night, I snuck back into the mansion and installed one near the dining table and the other in my father's study. A few days later, I found what I was looking for. The camera at the dining table captured a hushed early morning conversation. "Be careful, Marjorie," my father warned. "What if Casey notices something?" My mother scoffed. "Casey is naive, and your father, well, he's barely lucid anymore. It's almost time." Then the footage from the study delivered the final, devastating blow. My father was at his desk, and my mother stood over him holding out a document. "Just sign it, Stephen," she urged, her voice a cold, silken whisper. "It's the power of attorney. Once he's in the nursing home, this will make managing his estate so much simpler." My father hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper. "Marjorie, this is my own father we're talking about." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "And we are talking about our future, Stephen. He doesn't need all that money anymore. He wouldn't even know what to do with it." My father was silent for a beat, then he signed the document. I saw his hand tremble. Power of attorney, nursing home, it all became clear. They were systematically incapacitating him to steal his life savings, his property, the very cabin he loved. I felt a white-hot rage mixed with a profound sense of sorrow. That evening, I showed the new videos to my grandfather. He watched in silence, his expression hardening into a mask of stone. When my father's trembling hand signed away his autonomy, I saw a single tear trace a path down his weathered cheek. All his life, he whispered, his voice cracking, I taught him about honor, and this is what he chose. We sat in the darkening room, two co-conspirators united by a painful truth. The stage was set for a final confrontation, and I had a feeling it was coming soon. The days leading up to Thanksgiving were thick with a tension that only my grandfather and I could feel. On the surface, the mansion was a picture of festive preparation. My parents, Stephen and Marjorie, decided to host a grand dinner inviting relatives, close friends, and influential neighbors. The house was decorated to perfection, with flickering candles, silk tablecloths, and the warm, inviting scent of roasting turkey. To the outside world, they were the perfect, caring children looking after their ailing father. Guests arrived, praising their dedication. You two are just wonderful for taking such good care of George, one neighbor gushed. My mother accepted the compliment with her flawless smile, while my father just nodded, a hollow look in his eyes. I stood in the corner, glass of water clutched in my hand, my knuckles white. I was a volcano of suppressed rage, forcing myself to maintain a calm exterior. My grandfather made his entrance dressed in a sharp black suit. He played his part masterfully, walking with a slow, deliberate shuffle, his expression one of faint, polite confusion. He smiled vaguely at the guests, occasionally fumbling a name or dropping a napkin, reinforcing the narrative my parents had so carefully constructed. It broke my heart to see him, a decorated lieutenant colonel, reduced to this role. But whenever his gaze met mine across the crowded room, I saw the steely resolve of a soldier before a battle. We're almost there, his eyes seemed to say. The dinner began, filled with polite chatter and feigned warmth. Then, as dessert was being served, my mother stood, tapping her wine glass for attention. First, I'd like to give thanks for all the blessings in our lives, she began, her voice smooth and practiced. She turned and placed a hand on my grandfather's shoulder, her face a mask of compassion. And I especially want to honor my dear father-in-law, George. As many of you know, his health has been declining recently. After much difficult consideration, Stephen and I have decided that the best place for him is a professional nursing home where he can receive the 24-hour care he needs. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the room. Poor George, someone whispered. You two are saints for making such a tough decision, another added. I watched my father, who stared down at his plate, unable to look at anyone. That's when my mother delivered the final blow. To ensure his affairs are managed properly and without stress, we have also finalized a power of attorney. We just want what's best for him. That was it. I couldn't sit there for one more second. I stood up, my chair scraping against the polished floor. The room fell silent. Before we continue, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, I have a short video I'd like to share, just a little something to honor my grandfather's recent memories. My mother's smile tightened. Casey, now is not the time. But I was already moving, connecting my phone to the large television screen mounted on the living room wall. I pressed play. The first clip appeared, my mother in the kitchen, carefully sprinkling the white powder from the vial into my grandfather's coffee. Gasps echoed through the room. The next clip showed my father's complicit nod as the drugged coffee was served. Then came the audio, their hushed conversations about his declining state, her cold dismissal of my father's weak protests. The final scene was from the study, my father's trembling hand signing the power of attorney as my mother coached him. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of a wine glass shattering as it slipped from a guest's hand. Every eye darted from the screen to my parents. My mother's face was ashen, her mouth agape. My father leaped to his feet, his voice shaking. Casey, turn it off. This is a misunderstanding. It's just a vitamin supplement. Exactly, my mother chimed in, her voice shrill. We were trying to help him. How could you twist this? But before their lies could take root, my grandfather stood up. He rose not as a frail, confused old man, but as the commander he once was. His back was straight, his eyes like ice. Enough, he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced the room. No more lies, Marjorie. Stephen. He turned to face his son, his expression a mixture of profound pain and unwavering strength. I spent my life teaching you about honor, son. What happened to those lessons? My father staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I stepped forward, my voice cold and clear. I've already sent copies of these videos along with the lab results confirming the presence of Ambien to the police. They should be here any minute. As if on cue, the doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the tension like a blade. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside. Mr. Stephen Everett, Mrs. Marjorie Everett, one of them said calmly. We need you to come with us for questioning regarding the illegal administration of a controlled substance. My mother finally broke, collapsing into sobs. My father stood frozen, his head bowed in shame. Our relatives and friends looked on in stunned disbelief. The perfect Thanksgiving dinner had become a public trial, and the verdict was written on every horrified face in the room. The family my parents had tried to present to the world had just been shattered into a million pieces right before their eyes. Just as the officers began to escort my parents toward the door, my grandfather did something that shocked everyone in the room, myself included. He raised his hand, his voice calm but firm. "Officers, please wait a moment." The lead officer paused, a look of confusion on his face. "Sir, we have substantial evidence of a serious crime." My grandfather nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said, his gaze fixed not on the police but on his son. "But I wish to withdraw the complaint. This is a family matter. I will handle it myself." I stared at him, my mind reeling. Withdraw the complaint? After everything they had done, the poison, the deceit, the planned theft of his life and legacy, how could he choose mercy? I wanted justice. I wanted them to pay for every moment of confusion they had forced upon him, for every ounce of dignity they had tried to strip away. But when I looked into my grandfather's eyes, I saw something beyond anger. It was a profound, aching sadness, but also an incredible strength. He wasn't doing this for them, he was doing it for himself. The officers were hesitant, but ultimately they had to respect the victims' wishes. They took their statements and left, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. All eyes turned to my parents. My father, Stephen, finally broke down completely. He fell to his knees, his body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. It wasn't the cry of a man caught, but of a man who finally understood the depth of his own failure. My mother sat at the table, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The architect of the entire scheme was now just a broken woman, unable to face the ruin she had created. My grandfather addressed the remaining guests, his voice trembling slightly but clear. "I spent my life teaching my son about integrity and honor. Today it seems I failed in my lesson, but I believe it is never too late to learn." He looked directly at my parents. "Stephen, Marjorie, what you did was wrong, a mistake of a magnitude I can barely comprehend. But a mistake is not the end of a life. Your punishment will not be a jail cell. It will be living with the knowledge of what you have done. It will be the shame you feel right now." He paused, his gaze drifting to a photo of my grandmother on the mantelpiece. "I forgive you, not because you have earned it, but because I refuse to let hatred poison the years I have left." His words hung in the air, more powerful than any legal sentence could have been. The guests began to quietly file out, their faces a mixture of pity and disgust. My father remained on his knees, unable to look up. My grandfather walked over to the door and stepped out into the crisp night air. I followed him, leaving the wreckage of our family behind. We walked in silence under the streetlights, the sound of leaves crunching under our feet. The Thanksgiving that was meant to seal his fate had instead become the day of his liberation. In the weeks that followed, my grandfather moved back to the cabin by Lake Fairview. The mansion felt tainted, a monument to greed and betrayal. I helped him pack, and as we drove back to the lake, I saw a light return to his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. We spent our weekends together, repairing the old porch and tending to the garden my grandmother had loved. It was a slow, quiet process of healing. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset, he turned to me. "Casey, I always had a dream of sailing the seas, of living my last years with nothing but the wind and the waves." I smiled. "Then let's make it happen, Grandpa." He sold off most of his assets, the very things my parents had coveted, and bought a lifetime residence on the Pacific Serenity, a cruise ship that traveled the world. The cabin he gave to me. "This isn't about money, Casey," he said, handing me the deed. "It's about memory. Protect it." I drove him to the port on the day of his departure. As he boarded the massive ship, he turned and gave me one last, tight hug. "Thank you for giving me my life back, Casey." I watched the ship pull away, tears streaming down my face, not of sadness but of pride. My parents sold the mansion and moved to a small, unassuming house. They live with their shame, a punishment more profound than any prison. I rarely see them. I don't know if they will ever find redemption, but my grandfather gave them the chance. I still call him every week. I see him on my screen, standing on the deck with the ocean behind him, the wind in his silver hair, a look of pure freedom on his face. And I live in the cabin, by the calm waters of Lake Fairview, protecting the memories and the lessons he taught me. The greatest lesson of all was that true honor isn't about winning a fight or seeking revenge. It's about having the strength to forgive, to choose peace over bitterness, and to sail away from the wreckage of the past toward a new horizon.